and the Ten Commandments. Members, questions for this esteemed panel? Yes, Senator Middleton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank y'all for coming today. I love the history that y'all bring with this, and I think that's important to point out. So in the Kennedy v. Bremerton case, could you maybe talk a little more about how one of the important rulings was that the Establishment Clause must be interpreted by reference to historical practices and understandings. So that goes back, to some of these documents that you brought here today.
It really does. The Establishment Clause was following up a European practice. One of the things, actually, there was an 1892 Supreme Court decision. It was a case of the Holy Trinity, and it was dealing with religion. And one of the things they pointed out is that in order to understand a law, you should determine the evil that was intended to be remedied, right? What problem were they trying to solve? And most people don't understand the problem the Establishment Clause was trying to solve, that the reason so many early settlers came to America, they were fleeing religious persecution in many situations, because at that time in England was Anglican. And if you weren't Anglican, there was a law in England that you could not meet in religious groups or gatherings or talk about God or Jesus in public if there were 4 or more people, because that would be trying to establish some kind of religious sect or group or church. It's the reason the Pilgrims left and went to Holland. It's the reason the Puritans finally left and came to America. It's the reason that William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, he's a Quaker. He got arrested so many times over in England for not abiding by the Anglican laws that were passed. But this was happening too. In Germany, you had to be Lutheran. In Italy, you had to be Catholic. And so when we are forming a nation in America, part of the context leading up to the Establishment Clause was we want to make sure that the government can't mandate everybody has to practice this specific way. So we can't say everybody has to be a Baptist, everybody has to be Presbyterian or Methodist or whatever it was. They said, no, we're not going to let Congress establish a religion, but the context also was that the Congress can't prohibit any of our free exercise. So they can't tell us we can't worship, but they also can't say we have to worship in a certain way. But this is very different than the way it's interpreted today, because today it's been largely interpreted that if you believe in God, you're trying to establish a religion. Well, that's totally opposite of the origins of the Establishment Clause, of the problem, to quote the 1892 Supreme Court decision, the evil they were trying to remedy was not keeping people from mentioning God, which is why I just brought one proclamation, a prayer proclamation from George Washington, 1789, but we have hundreds of these original proclamations. By 1815, there were more than 1,400 official government-issued prayer proclamations from the New England states alone. Every single founding father who went on to become a governor or president issued prayer proclamations. So this idea that you can't have any kind of religion or you're establishing a religion, it's a modern misnomer from a misunderstanding of history and a misapplication of the Constitution.
Senator, if I may add, one aspect of that is a legal aspect as well, because when we were looking at the Ten Commandments, we went into Westlaw and did the legal searches. All of our legal people went back and found hundreds of cases, state and federal, that cited the Ten Commandments as the basis of that law. I found it interesting that the court, and they weren't citing the Ten Commandments as an add-on. It was, hey, because the Ten Commandments says this is why we have the civil law. And they specifically, I remember they pointed to laws against cattle rustling. Laws against cattle rustling as being specifically based on the Ten Commandments. They said laws against election fraud were based on the Ten Commandments. Laws against white-collar crime, laws against defamation. So much of the culture that we have legally was based on their understanding of what the Ten Commandments prohibited in the way of bad behavior, and that's why we have the civilized culture we do have. So that goes to that concept of religion, that the presence of God or religion is not prohibited by the Constitution. Setting up a particular national denomination is, and that's how we got from there to saying that, as Matt pointed out, that you can't even let kids see the Ten Commandments. That's a crazy place to be. But now the court has taken that good step back.
Yeah, and you pointed out a good point on the historical context of it, because obviously the thing that I was referencing in my layout of the separation of church and state, that's not in the Constitution anywhere. The only thing people can cite is the Jefferson letter to the Danbury Baptist, but then you look at that in the context, and he was issuing prayer proclamations, right? So clearly, however, modern lawyers are interpreting this and acting like that's, basically twisting that was not how they saw it and how he saw it, in his time with his contemporaries. And I think that's why this, according to historical practices and understandings in this ruling, is so important, as it reaffirms that. So thank y'all.
If I can just add on, it was a huge paradigm shift in Kennedy versus Bremerton. For a long time, we had looked at it where it was kind of like, you kind of have to prove that this kind of religion is okay, right? But now, after Kennedy, it's almost like you're giving the benefit of the doubt to the religious practice. It's only if it doesn't comport with history and tradition. And I think a lot of times you hear on these kind of bills, well, if we're going to open it up for the Ten Commandments, are we going to have to open it up for this and this and this and this? There's no other document really in our country's history that comports with the history and tradition like the Ten Commandments does. So any other kind of religious reference or any other kind of document, even if I agreed with it, probably would not survive that constitutional scrutiny because it doesn't have that history and tradition. And Senator Menendez, just on the mechanics of SB 11 that we were talking about earlier, I would encourage you to look at the religious release time programs that we have even in Texas right now, set up a lot similarly to how SB 11 is going on right now, but release time lets you actually go off campus. And so you had all those kind of concerns and hesitations at first, but even going off campus, those programs have worked, they've been viable. So I think that would be a good roadmap to look to see how those have been effective. I think you'll see the same thing with SB 11, and the mechanics of it will actually flow pretty naturally.